Good evening. My name is Kevin Muehlman, and I am the Associate of External Affairs here at NYU, Washington, D.C. Please take this moment to turn off your cell phones as they do interfere with our microphones. Thank you. I am pleased to welcome you all to the Abramson Family Auditorium for this discussion featuring professionals who work at the nexus of business and politics. This event has been made possible in collaboration with our partners at Abernathy, MacGregor. I'd especially like to thank Liz Sidoti and Caitlin Brogan for their help. It is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Nachmas, Managing Director and Head of the DC Abernathy MacGregor office. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Kevin. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. We want to thank the team at NYU for letting us co-host this event with them today. We're really excited to be here. I know NYU is an entity that needs no introduction, but Abernathy MacGregor may for some of you here in the room. We're new in town, but not new to the business. Abernathy MacGregor is a strategic communications firm, and we specialize in advising CEOs, board directors, and senior executives on how to do effective stakeholder communication, engagement, helping them with advocacy initiatives. And one thing we realized as you're looking at that nexus between business and between politics is that it would be beneficial to have a DC office. So in September of this year, we launched a DC office. Liz and I are part of that team to further help with those key intersections. My guess is everyone in this room is seeing that Washington and Wall Street are more entwined than ever before. Combining with the unpredictable and contentious political environment, the year ahead is bound to be an interesting one, and the possible business implications are uncertain for the board, for C-suite, for the street. So this evening we're going to start to look at that, look at how corporations should be thinking about these issues, and look at the intersections between these issues. So before we get started, I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists. Hopefully you had a chance to see their detailed, extensive bios on your invitation when it was received. But I'm going to start over on the far left, far away from me, is Ashley Davis. Ashley is a principal at Westfront Strategies. It's a lobbying firm that she was part of founding in 2015. She has years of experience in the executive branch, including special assistant to the national director and then Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge. Next to Ashley, we have Mike Gottlieb. Mike is the president and general counsel of Ballast Research. He has over 20 years experience in Washington as a consultant, policy advisor, and an attorney. Prior to his tenure at Ballast, he was a number of roles in the government, including special assistant to the President of the United States and associate White House counsel to the President. Next to Mike, we have Stacy Dion. Stacy's the managing director and head of global government affairs for Carlyle Group. She leads the government relations function. Before joining Carlyle, Stacy was the head of corporate public policy for the Boeing Company. Prior to that, she held a number of roles in the government, including policy advisor and counsel in the office of the Republican leader. And our last panelist is Jason Miller. He is the chief executive officer of the Greater Washington Partnership. Prior to that role, Mike was deputy assistant to the president and deputy director of the National Economic Council in the White House, where, among other things, he led the Obama administration's economic development. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, who I'd like to briefly introduce you to as well, Liz Sidoti. Liz is part of the Abernathy MacGregor team, where she's a managing director. Prior to joining Abernathy, she spent 5 years leading U.S. communications for BP, helping the global company, oil company, recover from the Deepwater Horizon accident. She also previously was the national political correspondent, national political editor of the Associated Press. So Liz, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Okay, and thank you for that introduction. Thanks to Kevin and NYU, and thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. We know that it's hard on a Thursday night in Washington, particularly with all kinds of other commitments and your busy schedules to be here. But as Sarah said, we really thought that this would be an interesting moment to draw together folks who really are at that nexus of business and politics. What I know about business really likes certainty, and at this point in time, in the world we're living in, I would argue that it's probably one of the most uncertain, unstable situations for understanding where business is headed, much less politics. And so where I want to start with is trying to figure out how do we really separate the noise, and what kind of advice do you all give, whether it's your portfolio companies, your clients, your members, about how to navigate this period of uncertainty. So, Mike, if we can start with you.
Yeah, happy to. So I run a firm that does research for corporations and trade associations advocating in Washington. And among the things that we do is try to provide a framework to answer this question. It doesn't necessarily answer the question, what do you focus on? But it provides a framework that is itself derived from what policymakers tell us. So ultimately, I agree with Liz that there is more noise in the space than there ever has been before. And actually, the work that we all do in Washington is harder, I would say, than it ever has been before. There are more advocates, there are more stakeholders. It is more of a partisan environment than we've seen before. And so ultimately, what we advise our clients is to maintain focus on key strategies. And part of that challenge is advocating back to their own stakeholders, which is to say the C-suite, their members if they're an association. One of the things that's most challenging, I think, among our clients is getting support, resources, budget, and also focus from the CEO, from the CFO, from the board of directors. Ultimately, we provide data to provide a framework based on policymaker feedback, and it articulates a number of different measures. But I think ultimately it's establishing a framework that the C-suite and that corporate stakeholders can buy into in order to keep the focus throughout what is going to become, I think, an even more intense and even more difficult environment in which to advocate.
Thanks, Stacey.
Yeah, thanks very much. What we do to prepare, for example, our deal teams and portfolio companies is, first of all, look at what's bipartisan, but that's, everyone should be doing that. But then what we do is look at, because we're industry agnostic, what are the issues where it requires just executive action, requires legislative change or regulatory changes, and what requires congressional legislative changes. But the matrix isn't as simple as that, though, because there's nuance, and that's why having government affairs is so important in that. So I'll give you an example. Say Elizabeth Warren becomes president, and you basically, with a stroke of a pen, executive action to stop fracking on federal lands. Sure, absolutely, 100% she can do that. But would she do it, given where the fracking is actually going on? Those are sometimes purple states, those are blue states, and those are held by senators that are Democratic. And it will have a huge economic impact on their state. So there are multiple stakeholders and considerations. So it isn't just black and white, and you really have to look into the nuances.
And so it sounds like to me that you also have to look forward and plan for, you have to do a lot of different scenario planning based on how the electoral situation could shake out, and not just at the presidential level, but also at the statewide level. Ashley?
Well, yeah, but I 100% agree with you. With the stroke of a pen, you can undo a lot of regulatory measures, but some of the things that Senator Warren's running on, some of the things that Trump ran on, some of the things that Bernie Sanders is running on, they can't happen without congressional approval. And so there's a lot of people that were like, oh my gosh, like life's gonna end if she gets elected or if he gets elected or whatever. But looking forward, if Mitch McConnell still controls the Senate, putting a tax, which you would know better than me from your background, putting a tax on the rich for Elizabeth Warren's going to be like really hard to do. And so she can run on that all day long, and that can, fluctuate the market or whatever, but like it needs congressional approval. So, I don't know if the American people really recognize the three powers of government. And so not only, like you said, a lot of things over the years have been done over executive action because it's been so partisan, but a lot of the other major issues that haven't been done is because you can't get it through congressional approval.
Yeah. Jason, you run CEO of what I think of as an economic development engine for the region of Washington, stretching from Baltimore down to Richmond. So are your member companies really worried or paying all that close attention to what's going on at the national level, or are they more concerned and more focused on kind of what's going on in the backyard here and how to be a partner locally, given all that noise that's going on at a national level?
Sure. There's not one answer to that. So just our organization, the Great Washington Partnership, we have an alliance of the large employers in Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. That ranges from, Capital One, Northrop Grumman, MedStar Health, as for-profit as non-for-profit, in total almost 250,000 employees across the region. When you think about this region, the impact of the federal government is both direct to their companies, but also to the region, right? So federal government is here. There are hundreds of thousands of people directly employed. When you have temporary shutdowns, it has multi-billion-dollar impacts on the region, which might have impacts on companies that have nothing to do with the direct business of government on a day-to-day basis. So it's a bit of a complicated question. Yes, the Northrop Grummans of the world are thinking very deeply about what's going to happen. That is their core customer. But at least in terms of how they think about sort of the day-to-day and their employees, it will be a bit of a secondary concern.
Right. Okay, that makes sense to me because we've sort of seen a lot of this before, right? Every 4 years, we have a lot of focus on what the outcome of the next election is going to be. We have these same questions on how should business prepare and what should we do. There's an added, more than a wrinkle to this right now, which is what's been going on Capitol Hill for the past couple of days, and that's the active impeachment investigation and now very public impeachment investigation. So does Washington grind to a halt here now that it's so partisan? Is anything going to get done over the next year? And how do companies posture? Do they wait? Do they wait for the next election, wait for us to get through this period of partisanship and acrimony where it feels like nothing is getting done? Mike?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think our firm looks at it from the perspective of the policymaker, and one thing that we're able to articulate to our business colleagues is, just as they have a consumer audience, just as they have an employee audience, a Wall Street audience, for some of them a scientific audience, those are each aspects of their brand, so too there is a policymaker audience. And the brand and reputation that the company or the industry or the entire business sector builds is one that's built over time. Whether that's during an impeachment or not, whether that's during a Warren administration or a Trump administration, there will, for the foreseeable future, be Democrats and Republicans. They will each have partisan views on those policy goals. And so I would say, although I entirely agree that some of the movement is more likely to be in the state and local jurisdictions, that does not at all license the responsible business from pulling up or out of the federal space, nor does the gridlock, if we are going to call it that, nor does impeachment. Just as you would not do that if there's a particular consumer market that is stagnant for the time being. You still have a brand and reputation in that market. There is still vulnerability if it is not strong, if you're not continuing to build on it. So I guess perhaps it's a bit of a punt, but I kind of think of it as the difference between short-term and long-term. Whether or not it's a Warren administration or a Trump administration or what have you, you're still going to have this spectrum of audience to engage, to win over, and to convince for the long term of your business. And I actually do think, and on just this last point, that the business community, for all of the interesting changes in responsibility that I think they're going through, the BRT letter, et cetera, has an opportunity to be a long-term stakeholder that is able to, based on credible data and evidence, articulate a policy perspective for the benefit of the next 30, 40, 50 years rather than either the next quarterly earnings or the next election cycle.
Yeah, so I think there's sort of the question around what does business do related to 2020 election, and then how does business deal with what's happening in 2020? So I take them as two different things. And just building off of that, we're at a time where the trust in major institutions, including and in particular big business, is at almost historic lows. So you have number one, trust in big business is at very, very low levels. The interesting thing is that the expectations on major institutions, including big business, is incredibly high. It's incredibly high from their employees. It's incredibly high from the communities in which they operate. It's incredibly high from their customers and their partners. So you have this interesting dynamic, no trust in the motivations of big business, huge expectations that big business needs to be contributing to society, needs to be doing things consistent with employees' expectation of working at a place that excites them and energizes them every day. And I think that's a unique challenge right now, and I think you see a lot of companies working through what that means, both in terms of how are we contributing back into our community in a more profound way than maybe 15 or 20 years ago we thought about, and then what are the expectations of our employees, and what does that mean for us as an organization, not just how does policy impact our sort of core business, but how do our views on policy, what we're doing in the community, impact our ability to attract and retain people? Because the shift over the last several decades is the core competition between companies is over their ability to attract and retain and develop talent, and that is starting to impact how they think about how are we contributing to our community, how are we influencing policy in different ways, and what's our voice and our brand around that.
Sounds to me like what you're saying a bit is that there's an interconnection here that is at almost an all-time high between policy and the health of companies and how companies engage, and they're engaging in a policy space in a much bigger and more profound way than ever before, in part because their employees are demanding it. Is that right? Is that what you guys are saying?
Not because their employees demand it. I think those of us, and first I want to talk about you asked about the impeachment hearings, where they're having no direct impact, obviously, on the business community. But what they are having an impact on is the calendar and the clock, because you're taking up valuable time to do committee business, floor business, and there are only so many legislative days on that side of it. So there are still a lot of really important, serious issues to reconcile with respect to government funding, Ex-Im Bank reauthorization, NDAA, and drug issues, pricing issues. And so it does distract from that. However, having said that, I do think it's important to stress that those of us that are in the business of government are serious professionals and not partisan. So I appreciate the fact that there's a lot of noise at the top, but if you fly your flag and draw a line in the sand, then you're basically going to be irrelevant very quickly in this town, and you really cannot get your job done. So with respect to the issues in engaging, I think it's a responsibility of corporate America to engage in policies, because I call it legislating in a vacuum, and having been a former committee counsel, I can say this. If you only taking opinions and thoughts for people that have think the same way you do, or just academia, or just the business community, or just this organization, it's probably one of the more dangerous things you can do. You do need to understand the issues in the entirely from a technical perspective, and then impact on stakeholders. And so from that perspective, corporate America is engaging, and they should engage. Quite honestly, it's their obligation to engage. So I'll give you an example. During the 2017 tax reform bill, we did a lot of modeling, because we're industry agnostic and invest across all sectors. And so we found that with all of the different components, we could actually model the impact on a healthcare company, or an industrial company, or a tech company, and providing that information to people is not a bad thing, and it's not nefarious, it's not self-serving. It's actually giving people to understanding what the real world impact is.
Okay, so can we all agree that corporations have to engage in the policy space, right? But Ashley, what don't they get about
that's
Washington?
what I was just gonna, yeah.
What is the
ah!
C-suite? What does Wall Street not get about Washington?
Well, and I think, all these guys know. I'm going through this right now with several clients in regards to the drug pricing legislation, which is a big deal in the House of Representatives right now. Nancy Pelosi is the leader of this. And everyone in Washington knows, this bill is going absolutely nowhere. But for my healthcare clients, I'll say, you need to at least participate in the process in case parts of this bill get to be a part of a year-end package or whatever moving forward. But I think what you started to touch on, I mean, there's very few pieces of legislation that are going to pass. I think that everyone's going to do a year-end funding bill because no one's going to want to shut down the government during an impeachment. And then there may be the trade deal that gets done and the Defense Authorization Act. But I don't know if very many people remember what happened during Clinton. I mean, the Senate will shut down for 4 to 6 or 8 weeks starting in January if the House decides to impeach the president, which I'm 100% think they will. So Leader McConnell and the senators are all preparing to shut down for 2 months, which they will be in their seats Monday through Saturday from noon till 6 p.m. in front of Justice Roberts, who will be presiding over the Senate in a trial, like we're in, like a true jury, and all 100 senators are supposed to be in their seats and listening to this trial. And so there may be a very few committees meetings that will happen in the morning, but Washington will shut down, and in regards to the Senate. But also, I look at it from a political hat. If I was Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or all these senators on the Democrat, six senators that are running on the Democrat side, are you in your seat presiding over the Senate impeachment of the president that you're running against, or are you campaigning in Iowa and New Hampshire, and whatever? And I think that Iowa's February, whatever, the first 2 weeks of February. So, I mean, it's just going to be chaotic, and I think that if you're preparing your business, going back to that, taking my political hat off, is even from a drug pricing perspective, going through that. If you talk to Mitch McConnell off the record or whatever, I know we're not off the record, but there's no way Mitch McConnell's bringing up a drug pricing bill in an election year, unless it's very tight and something that everyone can agree on. There's not a so there's going to be little done in 2020 as well, even if the first quarter is completely shut down by an impeachment proceeding. And I don't think anyone realized that Justice Roberts is going to be like presiding over the Senate. I mean, this is like crazy. I mean, I remember it from when I was 20 or 23 for Clinton,
Right.
but I mean, it's
It's a historic moment.
a historic moment.
It will be, again, if the House votes to convict or votes to impeach, and the Senate then takes it up. Okay, so it's one of the biggest questions that we get, what do companies do in this situation? And do they just wait? I mean, we talked a little bit about this. I think what these questions have kind of brought to light for me is the real disconnect between Wall Street and Washington and the C-suite, and how how nothing happens in a vacuum anymore, that all three of those pieces kind of affect each other and need to be looked at holistically. So Ashley, I'm going to let you off the hook, and I'm going to ask Jason instead, but what do you think Washington doesn't get about business?
So I'll answer that question both from my current role and spending 7 years in the federal government. Look, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding back and forth. I think, look, the core thing is you have a bunch of individuals who are sitting in large organizations operating behind a bunch of incentives and rules that are set in front of them. Like, it's actually not that complicated. This notion that there's one set of incentives over here from which government operates that is dramatically different from the set of incentives that business operates is just not right? Business is operating, depending on how the organization is structured, to maximize whatever set of values it has established, whether it's stakeholder value, shareholder value, et cetera. It's actually not that complicated. I also used to be a management consultant, so I saw it inside business as well. And I think that it is from a policymaker lens, from a Washington lens, looking out to business, you know, there is, and you said this as well, you can get a lot of information, a lot of data that can make you a lot smarter as a policymaker by engaging with business in the right way. You also have to understand what is the story that business is trying to sell you as a policymaker when you're trying to get the information that is going to make better decisions. And I think that Washington does not understand really what motivates and drives business in a consistent way. I don't know if you all agree, but I think that's, you know, I think there's like an odd language barrier, right, where we use similar words that have different meanings. We have a set of incentives as individuals and organizations that we're trying to achieve a set of outcomes, and one side thinks the other is completely wacky, and the other side thinks the other is completely wacky, they're not that different. I mean, at least my perspective, having been on both sides, it's not that different.
No, I'm sorry. Because I have a lot of clients that will be like, oh my God, if Congress doesn't do this by December 31st, like everything in my world is going to shut down. But like December 31st comes and goes, and like everything's like okay. So I think it goes both ways. But there is a certainty in the market. Like I look right now with tax extenders, and so like people would love to know what's happening with tax extenders in certain industries, whatever it is, and if you talk to the corporate world, they're like, well, Congress needs to know that I need to know by the end of the year. But then Congress is kind of like, I don't really care, right? And so it's that given, you know, it is that, I think what you were saying is it's that, oh my God, the sky's falling, but is it really falling?
Well, and how do we bridge that gap? Go ahead.
Well, so I'll say this from because it's probably the simplest and the easiest for what Washington doesn't get about business is a simple thing like what's feasible and not to implement for a business. Just something as simple as that. So, you know, and by the way, when companies use the word devastating, I shut down immediately. It's like, it's not devastating. Stop saying that. But on that side of
But it might feel that way.
It might feel that way,
through
but
their prism, right?
just, you know, just as unsolicited advice, never put that in a letter to Congress. But I will say this, and I'll give you something, it's a simple example, disclosure. So disclosure, let's say, for the types of benefits that you provide. I remember having this discussion. Well, just disclose your plan designs. Just disclose. Just tell us what it is. Just give it to your employees. You should be able to do that. Why aren't you telling them what all of the options are available? I said, well, because I have 170,000 employees and 600 plan designs, and I guarantee you they don't want to know about and things that they really aren't eligible for. So that's one side of it on that side. Some of it we just can't, data that we can't collect or do. And, you know, it's simple as that, but I don't think that they understand feasibility. DC gets what's feasible and what's not from an implementation perspective.
So, Mike, how do we bridge that gap? There's two different languages are being talked about, right? You have Wall Street speaking one way. So I think of that as the market. You have Washington speaking another way, kind of that non-market world. And then we haven't even talked about the internal politics of being in the C-suite, right? So 3 different worlds. One could argue 3 different languages, not just 2, and a lot of talking past each other as it relates to Wall Street and Washington. So how do we bridge the gap?
So I agree. I think there's a language gap. I think there's a cultural gap. I think it's also exceptionally noisy in this space. So even if you didn't have the language gap, even if you didn't have really different kinds of training and different kinds of incentives, it's still impossible to talk to each other in today's environment. Impossible is hyperbole, but it is very, very difficult. How do you bridge it? I think there are 2 ways or 2 categories that I would suggest. First of all, relationships, which has always been true. That means showing up, that means being credible, that means having authentic relationships from which you can form the basis of conversation. Second is substance. And to the point that, or just to unpack the very question, what does Washington not know about business? What does business not know about Washington? The premise of that question is that there is an information gap between these 2 very important, powerful stakeholders. identifying what that gap is, and I dare say being helpful to one another, so that the businesses who are advocating on behalf of policies that are helpful to their bottom line think first and foremost, what would be helpful to the policymaker to understand this position? What one page or what piece of data, rather than the devastating advocacy and the World War III, which when I was in the White House, heard people say, this will be World War III. No, it won't be. And frankly, it makes it much less relevant. No, here are the practical implications. And we do see in our research organizations that have built a brand of credible, data-driven, long-term, thoughtful, reasonable, practical input into the policy decision, which is aimed at helping the policymaker, informing her decision, helping her understand, advocating to the boss, all of these areas. So I think just taking that premise from business, what is it that the policymaker needs as the end user to come to the right decision? And from Washington, what is the implication going to be of this policy? Just close with this. The most effective engagement we see is from the guy who comes from headquarters with the calculator in the pocket who says, look, policymaker, this is what it does to my spreadsheet. Let me show you the spreadsheet. Or the physician who says, this is what it does to my rounds. To actually make the practical implication of this very wonky, complicated policy that the policymakers don't understand. God bless them all. They don't understand the implications. So I think having an open mind towards where the information exchange can be most efficient.
And if they're constituents, it's even better.
Yes. Yes.
I said if they're constituents, they're even better.
I will tell you, so we study about 50 major associations in Washington. One of the most effective is an association that has become known as a credible conduit back to constituents, back to the districts. It doesn't matter what they're advocating on. They just have a lot of good relationships that they can bring together to the policymakers so that they can have conversations and learn about each other. And that in itself, that's the relationships, and then the substance comes after that.
Yes, we've got over 100 portfolio companies in the U.S. and well in excess of 100,000 employees through those portfolio companies, and mapped them out through the state and quite honestly through the zip code and sent them out. And part of one of their mandates is to know your congressman and understand, and vice versa. And so when we walk into a member on Capitol Hill, it is, okay, well, here are the 8 companies in your district and the number of employees and supplier vendor spend for the last 12 months. So they understand, so it's tangible to them that these are their constituents and this is the economic impact into their district. So you have to demonstrate your presence.
So, Jason, I'm going to pick on you here for a minute. At the Robin Hood Investor Conference recently, 2 of the biggest hedge fund universe managers in the world argued that Warren's election would cause a 25% drop in stock markets, and that Sanders would cause almost that much, right? At the same time, they talked about how a Trump re-election would drive the Dow up to, 36,000 points and be out of this world. So for those of us who are still learning these numbers and the effect of the markets, effect of politics on markets, how seriously do you really take any of this talk, if at all?
0.
Why?
0. I mean, look, first, I think there are lots of hedge fund managers who have made, individual successful bets and then, will sort of make the next bet and wildly fail. That is the business that they're in. So their next prediction may be wildly off, and you see that. So first, if hedge fund managers are making bold bets, you should discount that significantly first. Second, I think sort of back to some of the conversation earlier. One, government changes require more than just an election. It requires broad popular support for policy. It requires, oftentimes multiple branches of government. That doesn't mean individual changes that can have very significant impacts on a single company or a single industry can't happen. But in terms of broadly the economy, one, I think people, and this is, we as a country, the presidency has less impact on the economy than most people think, first. Second, the actual change in president has less impact on the economy than most people think. So people predicting, whether it's hedge fund managers, who I would discount on the front end altogether, or anyone saying, this election's the difference between this and that, you have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. Now, that said, I think there are some real and broad economic challenges that we face, and some very different views of how we should tackle those economic challenges. But whether or not one can be successful in implementing a set of policies requires more than just an outcome of an election.
So there's a real fear in New York. I've heard it a lot. I hear it every time I go up there. I hear it from friends down here about a Warren candidacy or a Warren presidency, and what she would really do would she really kind of remake how we live in the way that she's talking about it by changing and calling for huge reversals in everything from healthcare to energy, to income and taxes. Is the fear exaggerated right now? Because the fear of her coming in and kind of bulldozing corporate America really exaggerated right now because there's a real focus on income inequality as she fights for the Democratic nomination, or is this something that is warranted? Ashley?
I'm sorry, I have to answer this as a Republican because I feel that it's so overblown. Not that I'm...
The fear?
The fear. The same thing happened with Trump. The fear factor is more driven by people wanting to make the fear factor. I actually feel that, and not that necessarily I personally would want Elizabeth Warren as president, but I would have to say that how many times have we heard the economy is going to break down over the tariffs? Or how many times have we heard that the economy tanked when Trump won? Yes, if Elizabeth Warren wins on election day, it will probably go down for the day, but I would think that this country can, and again, is what I think you were saying, the country will work itself out because we're a really good country, but also that the policies that she would implement or he implements, a lot of them it would be devastating, quote, has to still be approved by Congress, why we have checks and balances. So, I can't believe I'm sticking out for Elizabeth Warren, but I don't I don't think that the world is going to come to an end in any. I just think I've lived for this with tariffs all day long. There's people that are predicting that Trump will do a deal with China over the impeachment stuff to make the markets go really high, and so during the impeachment stuff, and I'm like, and he does sway the market on a daily tweet, right? But it always comes back. So I just don't believe in the rhetoric.
So we're obviously an industry that is not favored by her campaign, as I'm sure it poll tests really well. But to get back to what I think we've all been saying here, there's a lot just more than the stroke of a pen, and quite honestly, a lot of the things that she's proposing she can't actually do unilaterally. So we logically set those out and what those look like. There's an interesting thing that you just can't, again, pay attention to the presidential side. We do pay attention to what goes on in the states as well. So, for example, there's a lot of, envy politics going on, particularly with tax. But, okay, let's talk about that and what happened earlier this month with tax issues, because there were a lot of ballot initiatives in some very blue and purple states. And while everyone talked about Kentucky and the governor, we took a look at the tax ballot initiatives in these states. I was actually wildly surprised. Every single ballot initiative in Washington State, Colorado, Texas, things are from your purplish to your blue, increase your tax to pay for infrastructure or this or that. Every single one of them went down. So it gives you pause where you say, where we're gonna, we'll increase the tax, but we're gonna pay for all of this, and you're gonna get all of these you're gonna get all these transfers and this. But gives you some pause when you actually come down to it. Do the voters really want it? It's an interesting question, but these are the nuances I think people need to pay attention to more so than the message testing and what polls great.
And I think, if I may, also we get sometimes seduced into the zero-sum game. So let's say the vote doesn't go, or the ballot doesn't pass, or Warren is not elected. Then do the government advocates for whom Warren's policies would be devastating, wipe their brows and go on to the next? No, that there is still in the country a demographic that was strong enough to support a major national conversation around X, Y, Z, whatever you like or don't like, and it is an error to not take that very seriously just because it didn't hit the 51% point. And I think people learned this after the Trump administration took office, and I think it would be error to not take seriously all of the elements of the national conversation that are going on in an election year and really take that back to the boardroom and say, regardless of who wins, what is our approach? What is our argument? Regardless if everybody's talking about impeachment for the next 6 months, it's not going to be every second of every day. And in fact, that national conversation is going to surface all sorts of other things about whatever may be important to businesses. And so I just think, again, for the long-term strategic approach, if Trump had not been elected, there still would have been a large sentiment in this country that is pro the current administration's policies. And I fear that it's only when the election, it's only when that individual is in office that people are really forced to confront those policies, and that's not strategic.
Jason, you had something?
Yeah, look, I think we're talking a lot about, elections and public perceptions and polling and things like that. I think it's important also, and you've seen companies doing this, let's step back and look at what the economic situation is, right? And this speaks to some extent to the BRT statement. If you look over the last 40 years, 40 to 45% of our country hasn't benefited, and to some extent is slightly worse off from a period that's had meaningful economic growth, right? That is a challenge. There are different views in terms of how we should attack that challenge, but we need to reflect that some of what is happening, some of the uncertainty in the moment is not just who are the individual politicians and what are they for, but is our system working in the way that we expect? And what's the role of large institutions, including major employers and businesses, in trying to improve the performance of the system overall in a thoughtful, beneficial way that actually creates the outcomes that we've been espousing that we want to create as a country, as an economy, as a community. And I think that influences how, what kind of uncertainty. It has definitely influenced the polarization within the country. And it underpins what are the kinds of conversations and the things that someone might want to take on, whether that's at the federal level or at the local level.
Stacey, did you have something? Are you good?
Oh, I'm good.
Okay,
That was
okay,
great.
no,
That was
sorry, I
fantastic.
thought
No,
you
I
were trying
agree.
to get in there.
I
I was
agree.
like-
No, I agree wholeheartedly. You're right.
Awesome. Well, I'm mindful of time, so I want to open it up to the audience. If you have a question, we welcome your questions. I could sit here and ask my questions all night, but I'd rather hear from you. So if you have a question, feel free to go up to either of the microphones and ask the questions. We'll take some from there, and if not, we'll continue. Thank you.
I'll ask a question. I'm old enough to remember the 1970s, the oil embargo, and the first time the federal government started talking about improving gas mileage in cars. The American car makers all got together and lobbied to try to change that policy. The Japanese car makers thought, hey, this is not a bad idea, and they went ahead to implement the policy. At the beginning of the 1970s, you would occasionally see a Volkswagen, maybe a Mercedes, but you didn't see any other foreign cars on the street. Today, it's very different. Maybe I realize your jobs depend on this, but should companies worry that much about policy, or should they worry about providing value for their customers?
Jason, you want to give that a shot?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can speak cars and fuel efficiency standards all day as well on top of that. But yeah, I mean, look, I think, definitely my board members, most of whom are CEOs of publicly traded companies, the thing that they're worried about, the top of their list is not what is federal policy. It is not the number one item on their agenda. They are worried about, hiring retention. They're worried about market competition. They're worried about competitor eating their lunch on product X, et cetera. So you're right. Problem number one should be, let's actually provide a product or a service that people want to buy. Let's provide a workplace that we can hire and retain the best people to make a better product and service. And for the most part, that actually is thing 1, 2, and 3 on most CEOs' agendas day in and day out.
I'd add, if anything, I think across our clients, perhaps our business clients don't care enough about policy, or don't understand it or its value proposition in the same way they attach to general counsel's office. So if you ask most CEOs, does policy matter? Yes, absolutely. Does it affect your bottom line? Yes, absolutely. How? Well, I mean, something passes and it's good for us. It doesn't pass, it's not good for us. Anything more specific than that? No, I'm not interested. Well, we're going to cut the GR budget 30%. Okay. We're going to cut the GC budget 30%. Uh-oh. Wait a second. Those are my lawyers. They're the ones that keep me out of trouble. So I think we, as an industry, as it were, of advocacy professionals, have done a very poor job of communicating the value proposition back to the C-suite. And that creates a situation where they don't always understand what I think you beautifully articulated, which is the role of business in policy to essentially help get to the right answer. Now, should that answer be governed by value proposition to the customer? Yes, principally, but also other societal values. So I think one of the things that we are seeing now, especially in the trade association space, is more demand from business stakeholders who are getting more demand from their consumers, more demand from their employees about what the value proposition of policy and advocacy is and how it actually works.
So I need to step in here as someone who who actually quantifies it and for our folks. So I agree, and I think the answer is it depends. Quite honestly, it depends what your industry is. I would argue that defense contractors care very much what happens on Capitol Hill or others. So there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum. There's a spectrum on that, but there are lots of impacts, in terms of whether it's an R&D credit or something along those lines. Quantifying your function is an important thing if you are in the business of government and in a government affairs professionals, and we do that quite often. So if we didn't help with this regulatory change, it would have cost X. If we did get this, it saved this. And so communicating that back to the C-suite is something that is basically a requirement. And if your government affairs professionals aren't doing that, or your consultants, then you need to get new ones.
Yeah.
I agree.
Immediately, right.
But do you think that's more recent? Do you think 10 years ago?
No,
it was
yes, because look at Walmart.
There's-
Walmart had a crisis 15 years ago. They didn't think they needed representation in Washington
Or
until
Microsoft or
Well, so
or Facebook.
There's
tech
this-
companies
5 years
There's
ago.
this saying in DC that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some industries that, turn their nose up at for a little while, and look what's happening to them.
So back to fuel efficiency is an interesting example. I'm interested to get all of your takes on this, right? So there are one set of policies that have like cross-cutting impacts on an industry, right? So if you think of like in very simplistic terms, it just is going to reduce overall returns across the industry. There are other things, fuel efficiency being one of them, that certain companies are well positioned to deal with in the industry and others are not, right? Those are two very different dynamics, and I'm interested how
I could talk
how
to you all day long about
think about
Tesla and the stuff that I work with them, because it's like you would think it's such a good dumb issue because it's like saving the world and saving the environment, but then it's like also like tax breaks for the rich. And so like it's like so amazing that there's one side of the hill that's like, okay, yeah, we believe in like whatever in regards to the environment, but the other side it's like, well, you know what, we're not giving you guys a tax break to do that because only rich people can buy Teslas. Anyway, this guy needs to take a question. I'm sorry.
I'm happy listening.
No, please, go right
You
ahead.
all are smarter than me. And
No, please.
I guess I'm curious about your reaction to the thing. I think it came out of the Business Roundtable, where corporate executives talking about the fact that maybe corporations shouldn't be merely focusing on increasing shareholder value, and that somehow there's a responsibility in a corporation to pursue some broader societal benefit or whatever. And I'm wondering how much you think that, frankly, is garbage, or it's something that will really make a difference ever.
So my co-CEO signed it, so I can answer that question. Quite honestly, the letter is years too late that they memorialized it, because having worked in government affairs for corporations for the last 11 years, we've been doing these things all along. The idea, I think there was the notion that your company doesn't care about your employees or your customers or the communities that they're engaged in is just absolutely false in my experience. And I think about all of the community engagement and benefits that go into what corporations do across the country. I mean, if you think about it, it's everything from who's on the ground with volunteering and planting trees and your turkey trot to the local hospital sponsor, children's hospital sponsor drive. And so this idea that now all of a sudden they're just starting to think about being a good corporate citizen is wildly false. The problem is they did a terrible job of telling people about it.
Let me push back on that, because I listened to some. The argument has been made, I'm not going to take credit for it, that's easy. That's easy to do, and corporations, in effect, pay nothing for that. If they really cared about societal interests overall, why aren't they lobbying to raise the minimum wage? Why didn't they lobby against, perhaps, excessive corporate tax cuts? Why weren't they lobbying toward things that might address the obvious income inequality, rather than, they can go out and give away free turkeys?
No, they do. So I'll give you an example. And these are all anecdotes or things like that, and we can argue about who bears the burden of a corporate tax cut, which is ultimately a worker, the labor, which has been proven time and time again. But I'll give you an example of what a lot of, I would say, your Fortune 250 do with respect to retirement benefits. They fight very, very hard to ensure the retirement security of their employees. That it's the funding ratios, automatic enrollment, automatic escalations. Employers are the ones who are innovating on that side. Now, I can do it on the healthcare side too. With respect, employers are the ones who innovate with respect to outcomes, whereas there are some parts of industries that make money off of you seeing a whole bunch of different specialists. The business community are the ones that going into, because they have 10,000 employees, and they can go into these places and say, I'm not paying you until you improve your outcomes. And I worked for a company that did that, and there was actually a 20 percentage point reduction in costs, which they shared with the employees, for things like making sure that the most chronic issues were taken care of up front. And so companies are innovating where they just quite honestly do a terrible job of telling people what they do.
And if I may just add, in particular, I think the policymaker audience. So I think some of the reputational work and branding has been stronger to consumers and not to policymakers. There used to be something called a company town. There no longer is a company town, and therefore, how does the company?
Washington.
Well, yes, that's quite right. Although less and less, right? As a lot of dynamics take over in this city, but how does the company clarify and articulate its long-held responsibility and investment and corporate social responsibility to the policymaker community? Among our audience, that's never been, or among our colleagues, our clients, that's never been a priority. It's mostly been consumer focused. This is what our consumers want us to be as a company, and then this is what our employees, especially in the tech sector, demand of us, which now leads to chief executives tweeting out policy positions on all sorts of things that don't necessarily have to do with the bottom line. But where is the engagement with the policymaker, who I think until recently businesses didn't really think necessarily cared about the corporate social responsibility, and now, based on our research, increasingly do. Now, there's a lot more research to be done on how and why and in what framework, but I do agree that it's not new that businesses are invested in or concerned about their stakeholders, which are also constituents, but the business community, especially in Washington and in policy circles, has not done a very effective job of communicating it.
No?
I think we've said enough.
Yeah, look, I also think, look, I think there's look, in my federal experience as a policymaker, my experience in the advocacy world is really at the state and local level. And I think, and some of inherent in that question is, is an organization's incentives aligned with, what whoever the asker of the question is thinks is the right public outcome. And I think one of the things that's interesting at the state and local level is there are many more instances for strange bedfellows between large employers and advocates within the community for a whole host of things that you wouldn't necessarily expect is what a large employer is going to be advocating. I think that is true to some extent. You guys can speak to it much better than I can about how that plays out at the federal level, but at a state and local level, advocating for better bus service in a community is like one of the things that we're doing right now. We need better bus. Do a lot of the employees of some of our companies ride the bus? In some cases, a lot do. And they can't get home from work because we don't have good bus service. And that means we need better local funding to provide better public transit. And it's not just because, it's not just the companies whose employees are impacted. It's because you have a stronger community if you have good public transit. Companies want to locate in places that people want to live. So the types of things that you're advocating for may be better aligned. And there's an interesting dynamic where, you talked about this from an individual district. In a community, there's 7, 8 large employers that have a huge impact on the local economy, and not necessarily deep political influence, but if you partner that large employer with a broader set of advocates, you can get really big things done in a very powerful way.
Sir?
Yeah, just kind of building on that, one of the questions I had was we talked a lot about the gridlock coming up, especially on the federal level, and kind of the federal government abdicating some of their role in driving policy in certain areas, whether it be infrastructure and other things that people are clamoring for. What role do you see businesses, and at what point and to what extent do businesses kind of take that lead, the business community take the lead? And I've been seeing some stuff about some of the tech firms when it comes to affordable housing and other things of that nature, kind of stepping in where policymakers at the federal level aren't doing enough.
Well, I think it's our responsibility as a business community to innovate and engage in the community. So I'll give you an example of what we do. We are redoing the international terminal at JFK Airport. We're going to be there for a long time. There are a lot of different jobs there, create a lot of different jobs there, not just construction jobs and the like. When we went into the community, well, first of all, the governor wanted a 30% minority and women-owned business portion of it, and not at the blue-collar level. They wanted the accountants, tax, and like we have exceeded that. And by the way, we're partners with the National Association of Building Trades, as well as a minority equity interest in that. But we went into the community early, and we do this a lot, although we don't tell our story. Because it's a big, big country, and different places need different things. You mentioned housing. We're working on housing in a different state. We're in Queens, New York. What does Queens, New York want? They want good jobs. They have 2 airports there. They want good jobs where people can work in their airports. We started an Air Academy. So we started an Air Academy that has different types of certifications, and we partnered with the 2 community colleges if, in fact, that was the route from that perspective. But when you enroll in the Air Academy, which we provide scholarships for, it teaches you how to do everything from handling hazardous waste materials to certain FAA certifications that are required to being an executive. We've given out tens of thousands of scholarships to kids to get them through this part of it, to have that pipeline, because that's what the community told us they wanted. They wanted really good, solid jobs. And it's not just about working in our airport. You move, you take your certification with you. And so you have to listen to community wants and needs, because they're vastly different across this great country.
Just to add to that, I think too, I would say that government's really good at passing policy after a crisis. So if you look what happened after 9/11, you look what happened, that there was a forced reason to have new policy. But I think in regards to some of these issues that corporations are dealing with, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's privacy, whether it's, I'm loosely saying climate change issues, that they should, companies and corporate America should be the ones that should be driving that and driving that policy, because it may take another 5 years for privacy legislation to happen, unless something major happens that forces Congress to come together to do it. And so I really feel it's the responsibility of corporate America to drive some of that policy. I mean, so if you look at what's happened with us pulling out of, the Paris Accord or whatever, it's like, okay, well, our companies can be doing what our government's not, or putting cybersecurity things in place, because I don't think until we get a really major cybersecurity breach, we're going to have big federal cyber legislation happen.
Yeah, that's fine. So that's fantastic. I'm mindful of time. I want to close, and thank you all for your questions. I want to close with a lightning round. Okay. What's the one thing each of you are going to be watching for over the next year as this presidential and congressional election plays out, as impeachment goes on and all this uncertainty we've been talking about all night? Jason, we'll start with you.
I'm gonna watch how my kids get a year older.
I was just going to say, I was like, I'm going to watch my son's hockey game because it will be more interesting.
I'm not going to watch what the pollsters say.
Okay. Okay, that's fair. Mike?
So this is such a cop-out, but I focus on policy and not...
Wait a minute. You're saying yours is a
Yeah,
cop-out? Did you hear that?
Yeah, we're talking about kids.
I'm just vamping so that you have some time. Our focus is policy, not politics. One of the things that I think, not related to impeachment, that we're going to see in the next couple of years is a reconception of how businesses use their trade representatives and the industry voice and the trade associations. I think there are changing expectations. I think there's a greater role, especially with the increasing noise. And all of these issues are issues that benefit from responsible trade leadership. So I think that's something, maybe not in the next year, but the next several years that
I'm going to say something for real that's a little Pollyanna-ish.
I will too.
Not that you went for real, I mean about my son. But so after Trump won, even as a Republican, that was very shocking for me, obviously. I had the ambassador of Congo, who's Congolese, was at my house the day after the election. And everyone was shocked about, and everyone was up in arms about Hillary losing and whatever. And he looked at me and said, there is no one killing each other over this election. There's no one dying over somebody losing an election. There's not lives that are lost. And that is what's great about America. And so that to me has resonated more than anything, because I'm like, we can hate our president, we can hate candidates, we can hate this, but at the end of the day, America's going to come together and be okay. And so to me, I'm like, this noise is just noise.
Yeah. Well, look, I think some of what you heard were that elections don't have as much consequence as the knee-jerk reaction that sometimes you see in the market reacting to that day's tweet. But elections do have consequences, and they do have meaningful impact on long-term trajectories. And I'm sure each of us has our own views on what we would want to see out of the next election, but they are enormously consequential. And so long as we maintain that approach, which I don't think we should take as a given, and I don't just mean in this current moment, I mean long-term, like in all of our memories as Americans, we have had a reasonably stable, situation with a peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah.
But it's on all of us. It's on both parties. It's on, all of the states, it's on us as citizens to make sure we maintain that the fights that we're having are over policy and that we're maintaining the institutions that have actually made our country so strong over time. And I think it's on all of us to make that work irrespective of what the election outcome is in 2020.
Well said. Thank you very much. I think you speak for many of us.
All right, I get to close us out real quick. First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you to our partners at NYU. But most importantly, let's thank our panelists for being here. I think we really had a fascinating conversation, right, on how business and how DC are connected, where they're not connected, what that nexus looks like, how it could be better, how to make sure it's not devastating in any way or fashion. And I think it's a conversation that we can continue. And for anyone who's interested in continuing, we'll be heading upstairs and having some cocktails. Please take the time to talk to our panelists. I've got my colleagues here as well. I've got Mike Hocha, also from our DC office here, and Karina Davidson is down from New York. So hope you get a chance to say hi to all of us as well. Thank you again.